Senator, where is this going tonight, if you had to sort of play this out?
Well, Neil, I'm encouraged by where we are. I think we're making steady progress. I believe we're going to get it done. I think we're going to get to 50. There's still a lot of ways this could go off the rails, but I think we're approaching consensus. I think we've got a good bill. There's still improvements to be made. The biggest area I'd like to see improvements is I'd like to see even further cuts on the individual side. But I think on the business side, lowering the corporate rate to make us competitive internationally, moving to a territorial system to bring capital back to the U.S., lowering the rates on small businesses. This is a pro-jobs, pro-economic growth tax bill, and I'm very encouraged with where we are. All
right. When you were talking about growth on the corporate side, then would you or could you be open to a rate that's closer to 21 or 22% if it means winning some of your colleagues over?
I think the details of this bill are still very much in flux, and we got to get to 50. We're working hard to get to 50. So individual details may change. So, for example, one of the big issues we're debating right now, Neil, is what's called a trigger. Right. Which is there are a couple of senators who are concerned that growth won't hit the projections, and they're proposing a trigger that if growth doesn't hit the projections, the corporate tax rate automatically rises. I think that's a very bad idea. I think, number one, automatic tax increases without a fresh vote from Congress is a mistake. It's a bad precedent. Number two, if you're headed into a recession, the worst thing to do is raise taxes. So, Neil, let me tell you what I've proposed in response that's getting a lot of traction, a lot of support in the Republican conference. It's two pieces. It's change the trigger. Instead of being an automatic tax increase, if the growth projections aren't met, have an automatic reduction in federal government spending. Like Graham-Rudman, automatically reduce spending. It accomplishes the same purpose, but it doesn't raise taxes. And here's the second piece that's even more consequential. I'm calling it a reverse trigger. What I've been arguing is, look, if you want a trigger on one side, if we don't get growth, let's get a trigger on the other side, which is if growth exceeds projections, if we get even more economic growth, and the projections are really pretty paltry, then the additional federal revenue that comes in from growth, 50% of that should go to paying down our debt, and 50% should go to across-the-board pro rata reductions in individual tax rates. That gives us the potential for a second serious tax cut to come in if we see the kind of growth that we're hoping and expecting to see.
What was the first part of that, though, Senator? If it's coming out shy, that in other words, the numbers are proving the debt is a little bit bigger than planned. Now, you're against a tax hike to prepare for that. I can understand. So what's your solution for that?
So what I've proposed instead, if the growth is less, if the revenues are less than projected, that there would be an automatic reduction in federal spending. Actually, what it would be is a reduction in the rate of growth of federal spending. Would have the same effect on the deficit, but instead of raising taxes, it reduces federal government spending instead.
All right. Now, you come from a state that has lured many businesses and individuals to move there because of the favorable tax environment. A lot of your high state counterparts are concerned that this puts them at a disadvantage. How open are you, Senator, to provide some break on the so-called deduction for state and local taxes or SALT?
So I'm very open to that. Now, I think as a policy matter, eliminating the deduction for state and local taxes is good policy. Why? Because the federal government shouldn't be incentivizing state and local governments to jack up your taxes. But it's only a good policy result if we're lowering individual rates enough that people's net tax bills have been going down. And so I've been spending a lot of time fighting for the residents of high-tax blue states like New York and New Jersey and Connecticut and California. Some have observed there's some irony that I'm fighting for New Yorkers right now, but I think as Republicans, we should be cutting everybody's taxes. And it's why I'm pushing this reverse trigger. Because, I was just talking with an economist a few minutes ago that was running the numbers. If we see even 1% more GDP growth over the next 10 years, that ends up being, for each of the next 10 years, that ends up being about $10,000 in additional tax savings per taxpayer. It's a big reduction in individual rates, and it goes right at the problem of those people in high-tax states lowering their expected tax liability.
Do you think people who pay no income taxes should get a tax break? They might pay payroll taxes. I asked, Senator, because your colleague Marco Rubio is a fan of increasing the child care credit. Well, that would to be, it was $1,000, now it's north of $1,600. He wants it at $2,000 in a Senate plan. But those people, say what you will, and of course a box of money to the federal government is a box of money. I understand where they're coming from, but
right.
It is not that they're paying income taxes, and many of his critics have said he's holding this process hostage to that. What do you
Well, listen, I support increasing the child tax credit. The current version of the Senate bill doubles it. It takes it from $1,000 to $2,000 per child. That helps out a lot of families that are struggling. That is a good thing, devoting tax relief to the individual side. What I'm pressing to do in addition to that is lower rates, lower the marginal rates so that taxpayers are facing less of an individual liability.
Beyond the rates that you have now, in the Senate plan, as we have, even the top rate goes down, I think, about a point to 38.5%. You're talking about beyond that?
I'm talking about beyond that, and the reverse trigger, if we see greater growth, would do that, would lower those individual rates. And I'll mention the reason why we've gotten rates down in this bill where we have is because part of the Senate plan is eliminating the Obamacare individual mandate. That was something I advocated for vigorously. A handful of other conservatives advocated for it. 6 weeks ago, we had almost no support in the Senate for it. And just 2 weeks ago, Senate Republicans on the Finance Committee voted unanimously to repeal the Obamacare individual mandate as part of this. And that's what provided the funding for lowering individual rates and for lessening the burdens of those who are in high-tax states.
But your colleague Susan Collins of Maine was concerned that you were opening up a Pandora's box there, that it would result in higher premiums for a lot of folks, you say?
Well, we were able to convince the conference, and the conference came along and adopted the position. Initially, it was me, and it was Rand Paul and Tom Cotton were the three who were really arguing for this.
But you did that by making allowances and protections for those who might be looking at premium increases, right?
Well, and next year, we've got to come back and address Obamacare repeal.
Right.
You know, the individual mandate is profoundly unfair. It's the IRS every year fining about 6.5 million people who don't have enough money to buy health insurance. And, 80% of the people fined by the IRS under Obamacare make $50,000 a year or less. About 40% of the people make $25,000 a year or less. So it's an incredibly unfair tax where, if you're a single mom, and let's say you're making $25,000 a year or less, you're working hard, you don't have the money to afford health insurance because premiums have skyrocketed under Obamacare. Right now, the IRS, to add insult to injury, fines you on top of that. That's incredibly unfair, and this Senate bill ends those IRS fines and lifts the burdens on 6.5 million people. That's good policy, and that also let us lower individual rates, which is also good policy.